Globalization. Few forces have shaped the world more over the last 4 decades, but as the world today grapples with geopolitical tensions and economic challenges, has the era of globalization come to an end? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. At its core, globalization is the belief that the free flow of people, goods and capital across borders is unambiguously beneficial. Increased international trade and capital flows have been a major source of unprecedented economic growth and a rise in living standards. But lately that idea has come under assault, with some in the West resurrecting protectionist policies from bygone eras to shield key industries. And then there are the economic challenges posed by the pandemic, inflation and the conflict in Ukraine. The question is, are we seeing the end of globalization or perhaps an evolution, a repositioning in a time of global uncertainty? Well, there's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Ambassador Jorge Heine is the former Chilean ambassador to China. He's currently a research professor at Boston University School of Global Studies. Ken Gichinga is a chief economist with Mentoria Economics. Also with us is Adam Posen. He is president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And Huiyao Wang is the founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Huiyao Wang, let me start with you. You know, we hear this more and more these days, that globalization is coming to an end. And we hear that even more loudly in the wake of the trade war that started between China and the United States, as well as the conflict in Ukraine. But there are others, like Alison Schrager of the Manhattan Institute, who says globalization isn't a phase, it's a force that cannot be stopped. What's your view on this?
Yeah, thank you, Anna. I think that globalization is actually in the upgrading stage. I mean, we certainly have setbacks. We have deglobalization, we have a setback, I would say. We had a big setback, but I think globalization is very resilient and is really will come back. But I think that also corresponded to, we used to have a unipolar world, and it's easy to drive globalization. Now we have a multipolar world, and then it takes a few rounds and back and forth to really reach new consensus so that globalization can be put forward. So I think, you know, we are in that kind of process adjustment, but I believe globalization is very strong, and that is what China is probably doing too, that they pursue the economic globalization for the last several decades since China opened up. But now also for a variety of, you know, China now, when it's reached the second largest economy, they have started the AIB, they have started the Belt and Road, they have joined the RCEP, they have now wants to join CPTPP and DEPA, and then they have done a variety of cooperation with China, Africa, China, Arab, China, Latin America, and China, Central Asia Economic Summit and Forum. And so I think globalization will continue. It just, I think China and the EU and US has to work together in order to really push this globalization further to benefit the global development and global south. So that I think that it's a matter of time of adjustment, but I think globalization is very strong. It will continue.
Well, you appear very confident that globalization is here to stay, but what do you think leads people to believe that it may be over? People who have doubts about this.
Well, that's true. Actually, what we are seeing is actually the world has, as I said, getting to a multipolar world. Then, you know, sometimes, you know, the countries who used to lead the globalization now felt that they're being catched up, and then they probably want to slow down other countries' development. That could be one reason behind that. The other, I think, the roots actually of the problem. Each country, since this into a multipolar world, and then every country has its own problem.
Right.
And sometimes domestic incompetence is really quite serious. So it's easy to shift the blame to other countries. You know, China often being a scapegoat for that.
Adam, you've written extensively about this, and you say that over the last 20 years, 2 trends have been corroding globalization. First, populists and nationalists have erected barriers to free trade, investment, immigration, and the spread of ideas. And secondly, you say the West has been forced to erect barriers to China's economic integration because China challenges what you call the rules-based international economic system and long-standing security arrangements in Asia. So in your view, where does that leave globalization now?
Well, I think the U.S. has also been challenging the rules-based order since Trump and Biden, so I wouldn't put it all on China, although some of it is. In my view, globalization is a multi-layered fabric. There's trade in ideas, there's flows of capital, there's direct investment, there's flows of people, there's movement of ideas, of technology, of business networks. And that fabric is getting frayed, particularly between the US and China. But it's not one thing that you shut on or off. There are places, including around the CPTPP trade agreement in Asia, other bilateral and plurilateral deals being concluded, other relationships taking place outside of trade that continue to grow. What is happening with the fraying of globalization between US and US and China each with other parts of the world is that the fabrics become more uneven, more tendency to tear. And that's what it means to not be in a rules-based system, not some abstract thing or hypocritical list of US wants, but the idea that the other countries, the other 57% of the world economy, actually should have some say and should have some fair treatment. And this kind of deglobalization between the US and China will hurt both our economies, but also, as the IMF, the World Bank, and the Peterson Institute have shown, will hurt the rest of the world as well.
Ambassador Jorge Heine, what impact has globalization had on the developing world, the global south, as it's sometimes called?
Yes. Well, it seems to me, going back to the issue of globalization itself, it's a remarkable story over the past 40 years. Because when it started, this current phase, which started in 1980, according to most analysts, the initial impression was that it was going to favor mostly the countries in the developed world, in the global north. That led to all sorts of demonstrations. You may remember the Battle of Seattle in 1999. And the idea was that globalization would benefit the West and would benefit mostly multinational corporations based in the West. Well, as it turns out, it wasn't quite that way. And many countries in the developing world, like China, like India, like others, benefited as well and did very well. We've seen a tremendous reduction in poverty rates in the developing world in the past 40 years, partly as a result of globalization. Now, what I find ironic is that, as has been said, the former great champions of free trade and of globalization, like the US and like the UK, are now talking about fair trade, whatever that means. That used to be something that was invoked by countries in the South and is now being invoked by countries in the North. So we have seen a remarkable turnaround with protectionism, with the imposition of all sorts of tariffs and barriers to trade, which it seems to me is very negative. Now, what I find remarkable is that free trade is now thriving in Asia. In Asia, we now have the CPTPP. We also have the RCEP. And Asia is growing at high rates, it's doing very well, partly as a result of embracing free trade and not falling into this protectionist trap. So I think it's quite remarkable, this turnaround that we have seen. And if we have to identify one date for that, it would be 2016, with the election of Mr. Trump to the presidency of the United States, and with the result of the Brexit referendum in the UK, which has led to this present anti-globalization stance in the North.
Ken Gichinga, let's talk about the continent of Africa. There was a paper which was written by the chief executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs, Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, and she says that globalization has brought many opportunities to African countries, but African economies have not transformed away enough from their dependence on the export of raw materials, and they may, for that reason, remain at the bottom of supply chains. So can you put that into context for us? What has globalization done for Africa, and what are the challenges that remain?
Well, Africa has been profoundly influenced by the forces of globalization, particularly over the last 30 years. And I think it's fair to say that there are three types of globalization. There is the cultural globalization, there's economic globalization, and political globalization. In the 90s, we saw the IMF coming into countries like Kenya, having the structural adjustment programs, and really forcing countries to liberalize the media. And really that's when the media started opening up, the internet, access to international news, access to Hollywood and entertainment. And what that did, it created tastes and preferences for Western products and services. Then we got the wave of economic globalization, where people wanted to participate in this global economy, to buy goods, so construction items from China, fast food items from the United States. The only problem with this character of globalization is it's highly underwritten by the United States. So the currency of choice is the United States dollar, which right now in Kenya and in many developing countries is in short supply. So a lot of people are really asking, is it necessary for this character of globalization to only be participated in United States dollar? Can we have other forms of globalization where people can participate without necessarily being tied to that particular currency? So those are some of the issues that are really raising concerns right now.
Ken, to the point that Africa needs to transform away from its dependence on raw materials, where do you see that going?
Well, that has had different impacts across the continent. We have two types of economies in Africa. We have economies that are very natural source driven, so the DRCs, Nigeria, where you have huge abundant wealth in terms of gold and oil, and the model has been driven along those sites. And we have the other types of economies that are more of what you call service-driven economies. This is economies like Kenya, like Rwanda, where they don't have a lot of natural wealth, but the human capital is quite significant in terms of its development, what you call the above-the-ground economy. So I think the character of those two economies have been different. We found in countries where they're dependent on natural wealth, yes, indeed, there's what you call the Dutch disease, where there's that dependence on that natural resource and a neglect of all the other sectors.
Yeah.
But I think when you come to Kenya and in Rwanda, you find sort of like a diversity of services, of innovation, and those are tending to contribute slightly a bit more towards growth and development.
Adam, let's talk about technology. And we've seen how technology has driven growth across the globe. And look at the impact that it has. I mean, you say that the corrosion of globalization will have an impact on technology. You said that innovation moves along a lot faster when there is a global pool of talent that is engaged. So what would be the impact now?
Well, I very much follow on what the professor from Chile was saying. I know he's now at BU. That the US and UK and others, including in Europe, are turning on the same principles they said to everybody else, and nobody knows what fair trade means except possibly self-dealing. And so when we think of technology, it is best that it flows. It is best that you have talent. It is best that the best technology advances everywhere. And we can see this no more strongly than in decarbonization and dealing with green. We need to get the better technologies out there. And if the US decides they will only take batteries and green technologies made actually in the US, and Europe does the same, and China does the same, then other countries, including in the global south, have no choice but to pick one, and it will probably come through political means or bribes or pressure rather than based on quality. And then adoption of a technology we all need in terms of reducing carbon emissions would be slowed or not as efficient because you'd have separate standards and barriers. And most of all, perhaps, in light of what the gentleman from Africa was saying, you would have a world where there's no hope of any developing economies ever getting involved in production or technology because it would all be held as state/corporate secrets in each of the three big rich countries subsidizing it, or Europe as a group. So deglobalization is bad news, not just for progress of technology, but implementation and adoption of technology, which I've argued is actually more important.
Ken, what are your thoughts on what Adam just told us, that there is a risk that developing countries could be sort of siloed off from the development, technological development that we see in other parts of the world?
Well, it's often said that one of the benefits of globalization is knowledge transfer and access to markets. But it's true, sometimes that knowledge transfer doesn't often happen in ways that are frequent and sustainable. But there is still credible evidence that there is sufficient knowledge transfer, particularly in service-driven economies, and particularly with the rise of the internet, the rise of social media. I think that we are still, particularly here in Kenya, we have mobile money, for example. Kenya is a leader in mobile money, way ahead of many other countries, even in the West. So I think the idea of supporting innovation, it's still a possibility within a globalized circle, but it needs to be highly emphasized.
Ambassador Heine, there is a feeling that globalization is fracturing along geopolitical lines. I mean, we've heard that before, and that in future there'll be two centers of economic power, one that is led by China and the other that is led by the United States. Do you believe that to be the case? And if so, I mean, doesn't that undermine the very concept of globalization?
Absolutely, it's a real problem. And that can be reflected in technology, as we just heard. It can also be reflected in trade and in investment. And let me tell you, to the sort of things this growing protectionism in the West can lead. We have the extraordinary situation in Latin America today, in which there are two countries, Ecuador and Uruguay, ruled by conservative coalitions that would like to have free trade agreements with the United States. The United States is not signing any free trade agreements today. It doesn't like free trade agreements. So what are they doing? Ecuador is in the process of signing a free trade agreement with China. And Uruguay is trying to do the same. Uruguayan foreign minister has just been in China. Now, isn't that awkward? Isn't that a very strange situation in which the United States is not willing to sign free trade agreements with countries in the Americas, but China is? So this situation may get worse over time. And if Asia continues to be the main locus of free trade and the most dynamic area in the world, well, I would argue that presents a real challenge to the United States, because many countries would be looking at Asia and trying to make deals and sign up with what is happening in Asia. So it seems to me this is a very significant challenge to the United States.
All right, let me get a quick response to that from Adam.
I don't have much to respond. I think that's how it works. If the U.S. behaves irresponsibly and is discriminatory, other countries are going to act. I think the key lesson, which we've been working on at Peterson Institute with colleagues in East Asia, is that other countries have agency. I refer to the other 57%, the rest of the world that is not in China or the U.S. in economic terms.
Huiyao Wang, let's talk about BRICS, the grouping of developing countries. They account for a little more than 40% of the world's population, and recent figures show that this group is now responsible for a greater percentage of global GDP than the G7 countries. How do you see BRICS and the New Development Bank, also known as the BRICS Bank, counter this sort of any attempt to retreat from globalization?
That's probably another development, actually. That was actually the measures probably the BRICS country take to for the anti-globalization. So we're actually seeing more regionalization going on, because the globalization, used to be very much pushed by the U.S. is long gone. We lose the driver now, but now China probably going to be another driver still. But on the other hand, we see probably more efficient now to have more regional arrangements like RCEP, CPTPP, DIPA, and that's how it works now. But also for BRICS countries, they are thinking of how we can do better too. So, for example, we agree with our friend from Africa said, why should all transact in U.S. dollars? Can we do something else? So that's what exactly happened in China and Brazil. The Brazil president took 250 businessmen to China, and then they said, why can't we trade in RMB or Brazilian currency? And the same is true. China is Russian too, probably. They are using the RMB, their own currency, to settle the trade. So this probably will happen as time goes on. If the U.S. is not really coming back to the globalization and coming back to be more active, the philosophy, the principle, the guidelines, a lot of them was actually initiated and invented by the U.S. But unfortunately, we are seeing that, all abandoned by the U.S., but probably at least some of that. And it's also very, very bad that we don't really have countermeasures for that. So I think it forces other countries to react. And I think for the rich countries, the potential is there because they have blocks to practice their beliefs. And I think that the currency is a good example of that.
Ken, there have been so many challenges recently around the globe. I mean, if we look at the trade war between the United States and China, if you look at Brexit, and then, of course, more recently, we've got the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And there are analysts who say that it's that conflict that is responsible for the growing rates of inflation that we see around the world, and that it is going to be the developing world that's going to bear the brunt of this. Do you agree?
I completely agree. When you talk about inflation, about 12 African countries right now in double digits inflation, and much of that is due to the Russia-Ukraine crisis. So Africa does disproportionately get affected, not just economically, but even from a climate perspective, from some of these geopolitical moves. And geopolitics leads to geoeconomics. I think the strategy that most African countries are having is to be able to hedge against any type of external shock. And part of the Africa Free Trade Agreement is to be able to find solutions within the African continent, so we are more resilient and less exposed to international shocks.
What is the other challenge that we hear very often, Ken, and that is that developing countries around the world, whether they be in Latin America, Asia, or in Africa, are increasingly being forced to make a choice here. They either have to choose to follow the United States or to follow China.
Well, I don't think that is ever explicitly stated in those terms, but there is a sense of posturing that every administration tries to project. Countries such as Kenya have tried to balance the East and the West. Kwame Nkrumah famously said, we neither face east nor west, we face forward. So I think we look at a future where we make as many friends as possible and try to maximize where our interests are at maximum stake.
Adam Posen, is there a problem with the way the term globalization and, of course, its implementation is seen around the world? I mean, China, when it talks about globalization, talks about win-win solutions, and there's a feeling that when the United States talks about globalization, it's more in the context of a zero-sum game, that one has to be a winner and one has to be a loser.
Yeah, I just published an article whose title was America's Zero-Sum Approach Does Not Going to Work, or something like that. Importantly, just a couple hours ago, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen gave a speech, which was the first one from the senior official of the Biden administration, saying China does have a right to modernize and grow, and this is not necessarily zero-sum. And I'm hopeful that that point of view will increasingly win out in Washington. But when we talk about the perceptions of the word globalization, it has been created with a lot of negative perceptions, most of which are unfair, some of which are about change, that people are opposed to change, and globalization embodies change and interaction. So some of the reaction to globalization is about entrenched groups that have prejudices, that don't like to see mixing of cultures and change. So there's a communications issue, but there's also a substantive issue.
Something else, Adam, and that is, I mean, is it sometimes too simplistic to say that, there's the United States and its allies on one side, China and its allies on the other side? Because there was recently a policy statement made by the EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, and he said that there is no solution to global problems without China's participation. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
China is a superpower, a superpower that is growing, that is present everywhere in the world, whose influence is considerable. Its political weight is growing, and its attractiveness for many southern countries is undeniable. For example, in ASEAN, China has become the leading investor. It has displaced us. It seems as if China has already started a process to anticipate the impact of possible sanctions. It is starting to play de-risking. While we talk about it, they are already doing it.
So does this tell us, Adam, that worldviews on globalization, they're fragmented? People don't just think in terms of one side or the other, in black or in white.
I think both. I think a lot of people do think in terms of black and white, in terms of average normal people, and that's unfortunate. I think in terms of diplomats and government representatives, it's very different. And one of the issues we've been trying to debate in the U.S., and where Europe, I think the European Union leadership is ahead of the U.S., is the recognition that China, with its current regime, exists, and it's not going anywhere, and therefore one has to try to be constructive. I do think that there are global issues which you can make progress on with or without China, or for that matter, with or without the U.S. But there are a couple issues, and the most serious ones, nuclear safety, pandemics, climate change and decarbonization, where we do need the U.S., EU, and China together.
Huiyao Wang, what do you think needs to happen right now? And we see at this time that there are rising tensions between the United States and China. We see that there doesn't seem to be any move towards removing those tariff barriers, for instance. The trade war continues. So what needs to happen?
Well, I think we're probably getting this kind of adjustment period. It may take a little while to really come to the common sense. So what I think for China should continue to pursue economic globalization. I mean, China has done this, AIB, Belt and Road, all those RCEP, CPTPP. Well, we see more security globalization going on. We see NATO happens, and of course also Russian-Ukraine war, and of course also but the problem that we have now is there's AUKUS, there's Quad, there's IPAC. So I think there's two philosophies going on that really drives the world apart. We do getting the multipolar world, but I think we have to work together. So I really going to propose the G3. Let's get China and the US and the EU to talk, and let's also safeguard WTO. Let's all join the CPTPP. That UK is joined the CPTPP now. Right. US is coming back. China is behind them. So let's all work through some dialogues and platform and resolve the differences.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching.